In the first lecture, we learned that Paul was central to the understanding of Christianity, both because of his historical activity and because of the influence of his writings. We learned as well that Paul was a figure of controversy from the beginning. It seemed that those who understood him didn't like him very well, and those who liked him didn't necessarily understand him very well. And after his death, as Paul's writings became part of Scripture, part of the New Testament, within Christianity, Paul was celebrated as the source of all that is good, and for those who didn't like Christianity, Paul was the source of everything that they despised in that particular religion. Paul has been, from the beginning, a figure who divides. Today, we are going to consider three critical questions which deeply affect the way in which one understands Paul, depending on how those questions are answered. They are called critical questions because they really demand a judgment on debated territory. The first question is personality or rhetoric. Which is it that we encounter in Paul's letters? The second question is creative genius or company man? Did Paul invent Christianity? The third question is, where do we find the real Paul? What are the sources for his life and his thought? Let us begin with the first of those questions, personality or rhetoric. What is the I in Paul's ego? Most readers assume, you and I have ordinarily assumed when we read Paul's letters, that his letters are a direct outpouring of his personality, so that when we read his letters, we encounter something about Paul's self. We have all been schooled in Romanticism, in which the principle is le style est l'homme, the style is the person. And when readers turn to Paul's letters, his ego is all too evident, all too obvious, and all too pervasive. Indeed, I suggest that this is one of the major hurdles for most ordinary folk in coming to an appreciation of Paul. There simply seems to be too much ego there. In contrast to the writers of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, who recede modestly behind their narrations and simply recount the story of Jesus, apparently in a guileless and straightforward fashion, although indeed they are creatively shaping those reminiscences. But they never intrude into the story. We don't learn anything about Luke. We don't learn anything about Mark. But in contrast to them, Paul always makes sure that his readers understand that it is Paul who is writing. It is Paul who is giving this particular directive. I, Paul, also have the Spirit of God, he says. This is particularly difficult for contemporary readers, that is to say, present-day readers. Ours is an age of celebrity, but not of strong personalities. Indeed, one could argue that the more we have celebrity, the blander our personalities tend to become. A truly strong, rugged, hard-edged, tangential personality in our present cultural climate has rough sledding ahead. And Paul appears to be exactly that sort of personality in his letters. Some find, in fact, that Paul's personality is not only everywhere present, but may, in fact, not be altogether healthy. Paul seems overmuch concerned with his authority. Paul seems to have an exaggerated sense of his importance. Paul seems to be suspicious of his rivals and threats to his authority. Does this smack of paranoia? Is he perhaps somebody afflicted with megalomania? There is also in his letters what appear to be rather sudden and violent mood shifts. Paul can wax eloquently and positively on his love for his community, on his desire to be with them, on the deep comfort he derives from their company, and apparently in the next breath begin to castigate people. He is perfectly capable of saying with regard to the circumcisers in Galatia, I wish that those who seek to circumcise you would have the knife slip and castrate themselves. Paul is somebody who apparently is up and down. Is he bipolar? And in Romans chapter 7, classically, Paul seems to present an ego which is deeply divided within, as he says, that which I want to do, I find myself not doing, and that which I don't want to do, I find myself doing. Is Paul then the classic example of somebody who is deeply schismed from within? So the question is not simply that he has a large ego, but this may not be an entirely healthy ego. And there has not been a lack of psychological studies of Paul based upon such clues. Many readers, notably Friedrich Nietzsche and George Bernard Shaw, have studied Paul precisely as such a original genius who created Christianity out of whole cloth, but that whole cloth was his own troubled and perhaps diseased psyche. Now notice the implications of this. If Paul invented Christianity, and if Paul is a sick puppy, then Christianity is diseased from the start. And so if the critics of Christianity have difficulties with what they perceive as psychological disorders in those who follow this particular religion, they have no further to look than the troubled psyche of Paul the Apostle, who lies at the beginning and at the heart of this tradition. So it's an important question. Now, these observations can be countered by other considerations. The first and most important is that Paul didn't invent Christianity. I'm going to return to that in my second point, but let's put that on the table immediately. But secondly, applying the categories of contemporary psychology to ancient figures is a very hazardous undertaking anyhow. It's not clear how much Freudian or Jungian categories really apply to figures of antiquity. Above all, powerful religious figures. It's not clear how much Freudian categories might apply to the Buddha, as far as that goes. But certainly in the case of a Moses, or of a Paul, or of an Isaiah, people who have a very powerful sense of religious consciousness and religious call, we are not dealing with garden variety personalities in the first place, and it's not clear how ordinary categories of disease and health can be applied. So we have to be extremely careful. But even if we do apply those categories, and let's for the moment do, we find that Paul demonstrates the characteristics of a fundamentally healthy personality. If we take Freud's basic dictum that the healthy person is capable of Lieben und Arbeiten, of loving and of working, that is, of having strong and sustained personal relationships, and of carrying out meaningful tasks in life, rather than being a mess and dysfunctional, then Paul clearly has a healthy personality structure on both counts. For all of his suspicions and worries and concern about his authority, both the Acts of the Apostles and Paul's letters show that he had many close intimates, fellow workers, colleagues, delegates, names that recur over and over in his letters, relationships of intercommunication and of cooperation that extend over a period of 20 years and more. So Paul is clearly capable of sustaining relationships. Even those communities that had difficulties with him, we find in the end tended to come around, so that the Corinthian community that wanted to throw Paul overboard as their leader, in the end cooperated with him and saved his letters that he wrote to them. So he is capable of sustained personal relationships. As for work, Paul's accomplishments speak for themselves. Here is a man who traveled tens of thousands of miles, established communities in urban centers, visited them, sustained them, communicated with them, stood at the center of a network of workers that probably consisted in 40 to 50 people, and organizing and coordinating their activities over a period, again, of over 20 years. He is not somebody who is dribbling in the closet. This is a person who is capable of major human enterprises, including that massive collection of money that he took up for the church in Jerusalem from among the Gentile churches. So Paul is a personality capable of sustaining personal relationships and of undertaking and bringing to a completion large and worthwhile tasks. He has the structure of a healthy personality. This is not a diseased person. But the major point I want to make on this particular question, however, is that psychological analysis is totally beside the point. Because the premise that Paul's letters are a reflection of his personality is a flawed premise. It's simply anachronistic. The most important discovery or rediscovery in the last 40 years in New Testament studies, in my view, is the rediscovery of ancient Greek rhetoric and the way in which it applies to the study of the New Testament. Paul, like other persons of his age, was trained rhetorically through the imitation of earlier works, and he wrote according to the conventions of ancient rhetoric. And one of the key conventions of ancient rhetoric was the capacity to speak and to write in character. The Greek term for this is prosopopoia, which means to put on a mask or to put on a face, so that one spoke and wrote in a manner appropriate to circumstances. Much in the way when we were in grade school or high school, we learned to write a business letter, a letter of consolation, a friendship letter. In exactly the same fashion, ancient rhetoricians had different conventions for writing to different circumstances. What we encounter in Paul's letters, therefore, is not the direct outpouring of his personality, but a rhetorically crafted ego. The angry Paul is a rhetorical angry. The joyful Paul is a rhetorically joyful Paul. Paul's letters are not written in the heat of emotion. They are carefully crafted rhetorical arguments. They are instruments of persuasion. Therefore, when we read Paul's letters, we ought not to read for personality, but for rhetoric. And by rhetoric, of course, I don't mean ornamentation. I mean argument. So in the question, personality or rhetoric, the answer clearly should be rhetoric. The second question is, when we look at Paul, do we find a creative genius who invented Christianity, or do we find somebody who's part of a larger movement, a company man? The question arises because of the perceived distance between Jesus and Paul. When people look at Jesus as he is portrayed in the Gospels, they find a fairly straightforward teacher, somebody who is an itinerant, who works in rural areas, who teaches in parables, who works miracles, but who does not draw attention to himself. Jesus is not a cult figure in the Gospels, partially in the Gospel of John, I must say, but in the Synoptic Gospels, not, but rather proclaims God's kingdom and talks about his Father's kingdom. And then we turn to the letters of Paul, and we find very little talk about the human Jesus. Paul does not record many words of Jesus. He doesn't tell any stories about Jesus. He doesn't report any of Jesus' miracles. We don't learn what Jesus was like in Galilee from Paul. Rather, in Paul, Jesus appears as the center of a cult. He is the Christ. He is the risen Lord. People are baptized into him. Meals are celebrated in memory of his death and in anticipation of his return. In Paul, Jesus stands at the center of a cult as bearing remarkable resemblance to ancient Greek mystery religions. How did this happen? How did we get from Jesus to Paul, is the question. Did Paul invent this? So it's a very legitimate question. Once more, recent New Testament scholarship has filled out the picture and enabled us to give a rather definitive answer to the question, and that is, Paul is not the inventor of Christianity, but rather is best appreciated as standing within a broader movement. Paul, after all, immediately following his conversion, was baptized by Ananias and was instructed in the Christian way. He entered into a community. He lived in the Antiochian community for a time. And we see that Paul was not even the only person who took part in the conversion of the Gentiles. We find other Gentile communities being written to by other New Testament writers. And when we look at other first-generation letters in the New Testament, the letters of John, the letter of James, the letters of Peter, and, above all, the book of Revelation, we find that Paul is certainly not alone in regarding Jesus as the resurrected Lord who is going to come again. So the cultic Jesus is not an invention of Paul. It is rather one of the ways in which Paul shares the broader Christian movement. More than that, when we look at Paul's letters, we see that he is constantly making use of community traditions. He uses Christian ritual traditions that existed before he came into the movement. He doesn't invent baptism. He talks about baptism as something that people have experienced. He doesn't invent the Lord's Supper. He talks about it as something that his communities are already practicing. Likewise, he quotes early Christian hymns, prayers. He even quotes the words of Jesus. Not often, to be sure. There are no more than 3 direct quotations of Jesus in Paul's letters, but when he does quote Jesus, he quotes him authoritatively. What Jesus says matters. And Paul does allude to the story of Jesus in very important ways, not telling the details of what happened in Jesus' life, but rather referring to the fundamental pattern of Jesus' character and Jesus' behavior as a human person. So Paul is best understood as somebody who stands within a tradition. At the same time, he is certainly a creative thinker. This is, again, one of the ways in which Paul is difficult for contemporary readers. Paul genuinely is a thinker, and he demands of his readers that they think with him. And because Paul's premises, his starting points, and his modes of argumentation seem alien to us today, the sequence of his thoughts frequently seem obscure to us. We know somebody's thinking, but we can't quite figure out what's going on in his thinking. But the fact is that Paul reasons very closely according to the rhetorical rules of antiquity. And the more we understand not only his premises, but those rhetorical rules, we also begin to appreciate what kind of thinker he is. Indeed, it's legitimate to call Paul a radical thinker. One of the most radical thinkers in the history of the West. And by this I mean that Paul cut to the heart of things. Paul's thought always dealt with fundamental issues. At one level, Paul demands, as I mentioned in the last lecture, a radical choice between polar opposites. There is a kind of a dualism in Paul. And so he is radical in that sense. There is death or life. There is slavery or freedom. There is the law or grace. There is light or darkness. And one can line up those polar opposites in columns. So on one side is light and life and spirit and freedom and grace and faith. And on the other side is slavery and death and darkness and the law and disobedience. That's fundamental enough. Basic choices. You have to be on one page or on the other. And this is the part of Paul's radicality that is most often recognized and appreciated. But there is another way in which Paul is radical, and that is he is also radical as a social thinker. Paul takes the major status markers of every culture, ethnicity, gender, and social station. Male or female, Jew or Greek, slave or free. And he says that within the Christian community, these are relativized. So he not only divides, he also unites. And the ways in which he does this are complex and difficult to grasp. But surely, if Alfred North Whitehead is correct in saying that all of Western philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato, it is certainly also correct to say that all of Western Christian theology is a series of footnotes to Paul, whose thought gave rise to Christian theology. Paul then stands within a tradition, but he is a creative thinker within that tradition. He doesn't simply transmit the tradition, he actively takes it up and works it into deeper thought, seeking out its implications. This brings us to our third question for today's presentation, which is the question of where do we find the real Paul, the problem of sources. I think it's obvious that the sources that we choose to construct Paul's life and thought make a great deal of difference to the resulting picture that we will come up with. And it can be said very quickly that our most reliable historical sources, both for Paul's life and for his thought, are found within the canon of the New Testament. We do have one apocryphal Acts of Paul from the 2nd century, a charming romance that centers on the figure of Paul. It comes to us largely in fragmentary form, but there is one part of that 2nd century writing which floated independently, that concentrated on the relationship between Paul and a female follower called Thecla, who was really the first sort of liberated woman within the Christian movement. She ended up baptizing herself and going off and becoming a preacher of the gospel. This part of the Acts of Paul from the 2nd century enjoyed wide circulation in antiquity. I bring it up not because it is of historical value, it's largely legendary, but because in it we find our only physical description of Paul. Paul is described as being short, bald, with eyebrows meeting in the middle of his forehead, with a prominent and hooked nose, and with bow legs. Doesn't sound terribly attractive to us. And scholars have puzzled over the significance of this physical description. Was it based upon any historical fact, an eyewitness? Was it a stereotypical description of the ancient Jew? One must be careful not to leap to conclusions about the significance of physical descriptions or ideas of beauty. For us, the description I have given doesn't sound terribly attractive, but study has shown that this description actually uses the conventions of ancient rhetoric concerning generals and leaders. Paul's bald head and meeting eyebrows and prominent nose and bow legs are all the physiognomical signs of a great leader or a general. Even physicality is conventional and ideas of appearance. But if we want to talk about Paul's life and thought, the Acts of the Apostles and Paul's letters are our sources. Let's separate the two issues. First, his life. If we want to try to develop Paul's biography, we must use both the Acts of the Apostles and Paul's letters. The sources have areas of agreement and of disagreement, and they must both be used critically. The Acts of the Apostles is what historians would call a primary second-hand source. That is, it's written after Paul's death and is recounting events in Paul's life from a later perspective, probably from the 80s, somewhere in the period from the 80s to around the year 100. It has certain biases and tendencies in its treatment of Paul, and these must be taken into account. Although there's areas of overlap in these two sources, there are also some major points of disagreement, especially on two matters. When and for what reason did Paul take up a collection for the church in Jerusalem? Both sources report it. They disagree on the timing and the meaning. What happened in the conflict with Jewish Christians that issued in the meeting in Jerusalem with the other apostles? This is reported in the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 15. It is reported by Paul in Galatians chapters 1 and 2. They differ dramatically on their interpretation. Now, for the historian, when ancient sources disagree, the primary first-hand sources are ordinarily to be preferred. In other words, we would much rather have the diary or a letter of a participant as an indicator as to what's happening than a smoothed-over account or narrative looking back to the past. This is a good principle. And when we talk about Paul's relationship with Jerusalem, it is probably safer to rely upon his version than that of Acts. Nevertheless, be careful. Paul, after all, is deeply embroiled in the circumstances. He is scarcely a neutral witness to his own life. He is passionately defending himself. In other words, what we get is the truth, but it's his version of the truth. And when he says, I speak the truth, I do not lie, we can trust him perhaps as a human witness, but not as a historian. So we must use both sources critically in trying to develop Paul's life. Now, what about his thought? For Paul's thought, we use only his letters. The Acts of the Apostles gives us no insight into Paul's thinking. When Paul gives long speeches in the Acts of the Apostles, those are Luke's speeches. Luke is writing in character. He's having Paul give speeches according to what Luke thought should have been said in certain circumstances. So we read Paul's letters in order to understand what Paul was up to. But here we find a further critical problem. Which letters? There are 13 letters ascribed to Paul in the New Testament, and for ancient readers, Paul wrote all of them. Indeed, they added a 14th, the letter to the Hebrews, which all scholars since antiquity recognize was not written by Paul, but was probably an anonymous composition. Now, in the course of time, since the 19th century, all of these letters have been challenged as to their authenticity on the basis of style, on the basis of theme, on the basis of their fit within Paul's ministry. At present, there is a scholarly consensus that says 7 of these letters were really written by Paul during his lifetime. Romans, Galatians, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Philemon, and Philippians, and 1 Thessalonians. 3 of his letters still find people arguing for their authenticity with decreasing degrees of allegiance. Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, and Ephesians. 3 of Paul's letters find few people thinking that he wrote them, namely the letters to Timothy and to Titus, called the pastoral letters. Now, I disagree with the scholarly convention, and I will suggest in the course of our class that there is another way of construing Pauline authorship. I'm going to argue that all of these letters could well have come from Paul during his lifetime. That is, he authored all of them, but he didn't necessarily write any of them. Nevertheless, the answer to these 3 questions makes a huge difference in how we read Paul. Are we reading him for personality or for rhetoric? I think rhetoric. Are we reading him as a genius or as a man of tradition? I think a man of tradition who's also a genius. Do we read the Acts or the letters? Both. I look forward to continuing the conversation.